Florence Nightingale's delusional granddaughter. That's what he called her when he thought no one was listening. Dr. Mercer, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Seattle General in Raleigh, had a gift for precision, whether in diagnostics or demolition. He'd spent 3 years watching Margaret Walsh arrive at 5:30 every morning, noting the trembling in her hands as she clocked in, cataloguing her associate's degree like a prosecutor building a case. He didn't know what those trembling hands had held in remedy. He didn't know they'd stopped trembling years ago. What happened next would prove that assumption costs more than money. It costs careers. The parking lot was still dark when Margaret pulled in at 5:28. Rain hammered the asphalt like applause from a crowd that didn't exist yet. She sat in her 2008 Honda Civic for 2 minutes, ritual, not hesitation, and pressed her fingertips against the small white scars that mapped her forearms. Shrapnel from a rooftop in Iraq. 8 years of rain in the United States and they still ached like fresh wounds. She pulled on her scrubs in the car, the fabric damp from yesterday's washing, and walked into Seattle General before the sun had any idea it was morning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic tombs. The smell hit first, bleach and something deeper, something that lived in hospitals no matter how much they scrubbed. Fear. Blood dried on tile. Hope evaporating. Margaret moved through the emergency department with her badge in one hand and a penknife in the other pocket, the blade worn smooth from 8 years of fieldwork. Next to it, a hollowed ballpoint pen. Insurance. Tools. Things you carried when you understood that protocols broke down faster than flesh under pressure. She arrived at her station and began. For bags aligned by size, 18-gauge lines first, peripheral access second, central lines last. Crash cart inventoried, defibrillator pads at the top, medication stacked in order of use during code, airways arranged from pediatric to adult-like instruments in a surgical suite. Her hands moved on muscle memory now, the kind that lived below thought. Check the suction. Test the oxygen flow. Confirm the ambu bag seals. She'd done this in tents where the walls were canvas and the operating table was whatever flat surface didn't have blood on it yet. She'd done this on rooftops in Ramadi where the sound of her own breathing competed with incoming fire. This was easier. This was home now, or close enough. Rodriguez found her in the break room at 5:45. He was a scrub tech, broad-shouldered and quiet, with the kind of eyes that had seen things and decided never to speak about them again. Former combat medic, 82nd Airborne, discharged honorably after his left knee took a sniper round near Kandahar. He watched Margaret work through her morning ritual, not drinking coffee, not checking her phone, just standing at the sink with her hand submerged in hot water, moving her fingers through invisible tourniquets, phantom for placement, checking non-existent pulse points. Her muscle memory had muscle memory. That's a tactical layout, Rodriguez said quietly. Not a question. Margaret's hand stilled in the water. She didn't turn. Which? All of it. The way you prepped Trauma Bay 3 yesterday. The way you position yourself during codes. The way you don't waste movement. He paused. That's not nursing school, Captain. She pulled her hands from the water slowly. Didn't correct him. Didn't confirm. Just met his eyes in the mirror above the sink and nodded once, so small it might have been a muscle spasm. Rodriguez understood. He'd been there long enough to recognize people who'd been somewhere else, done something else, survived something that made routine hospital work feel like vacation. I'll need your help, she said. On cases that matter. You already have it, Rodriguez answered. The staff meeting began at 6:30 in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and the particular kind of air conditioning that made everyone slightly too cold and slightly too sleepy. Margaret sat in the back row next to a young nurse named Jessica who was still learning which end of the stethoscope went in her ears. Dr. Mercer stood at the front with a coffee cup raised like a flag of surrender he had no intention of waving. He was tall in the way that required him to duck through certain doorways, as if his body was a privilege he carried with him everywhere. His suit probably cost more than Margaret's car payment. His watch was the kind you didn't buy, you inherited it or you stole it. His smile was a weapon stored in a handsome face, and he used it with the precision of someone who'd learned early that charm could negotiate with systems in ways honesty never could. "I want to discuss our protocols," Dr. Mercer said, and his voice was the kind that made you listen even when you didn't want to. Specifically, the incidents where staff members have acted on instinct rather than procedure. He didn't look at Margaret. That was the art of it. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room already knew who he meant. The associate's degree nurse. The one with trembling hands. The one who worked every trauma code like her life depended on it. These instinctive interventions, Dr. Mercer continued, bypass proper protocols. And while I understand the impulse to help, and I do admire that impulse, we have procedures in place for a reason. Chain of command exists to protect both patients and staff. Margaret felt Jessica shift next to her, uncomfortable. Felt Rodriguez tense 2 rows ahead. Didn't move. Going forward, Dr. Mercer said, I'd like to see more adherence to the chain of command. More documentation. More discussion before action. He smiled. More control, essentially. The meeting ended. People filed out in 2s and 3s, and Margaret was standing at the sink in the break room, washing her hands again, when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway like a thought she hadn't finished thinking yet. Margaret, right. He said her name like he'd only just learned it. I wanted to clarify something from the meeting. These interventions you make, the adjustments, the quick decisions, they come from good instincts, I think. But instinct can be dangerous in medicine without the proper credentials to back it up. She didn't turn. Kept her hands under the water. Your associate's degree is a fine foundation, he continued, and his voice had softened into something that approximated concern. But there's a reason physicians have 4 years of medical school. A reason we undergo residency. Judgment at this level requires more than natural talent. Margaret dried her hands on a paper towel. Watched it crinkle, absorb, fall apart. Didn't say anything. You're dangerously overconfident for someone with just an associate's degree, he said, and now his voice was warm, almost paternal. Almost kind. I'd hate to see that confidence lead you somewhere you can't handle. She looked at him then. Met his eyes. Held them long enough that he had to break the stare first, which he did, turning to leave with the smile still on his face, the one that had learned to weaponize pity. By noon, the whispers had already started spreading like an infection through the nursing staff. Margaret heard them in the hallway outside the supply closet, in the break room during shift change, in the quiet conversations that stopped when she walked past. Dangerously overconfident. Instinctive but not trained. Thinks she's better than the protocol. It was textbook. She'd seen it before in different uniforms, different hierarchies. When you threaten someone's authority by being too competent, too calm, too good at your job, they didn't attack you directly. They attacked your legitimacy. They planted seeds. They waited for those seeds to grow into forests of doubt. Hey, Margaret. Jessica found her at 3 o'clock, nervous energy radiating off her like heat from a heater. Some of the staff are saying that Dr. Mercer thinks you're taking too many initiatives without proper authorization. Is that accurate? Margaret was bandaging a laceration on a 73-year-old man's hand, her movements precise and practiced. She finished before answering. He said that. Not directly. But he's been talking to people. About protocols. About qualifications. I think maybe he's concerned about your judgment. Margaret cleaned up the bandaging supplies. Placed them in the biohazard bin with the same precision she'd used on everything else. My apologies, she said quietly. I'll be more careful to follow protocol. It wasn't true. She'd been following protocol. She'd been following it the way a surgeon follows protocol, with the understanding that protocols were guidelines for situations within normal parameters, and she'd spent 8 years operating outside normal parameters. But saying that wouldn't help. Saying that would confirm what Mercer was already insinuating. That she was dangerous. That her competence was arrogance. that her instincts couldn't be trusted. Rodriguez brought her a coffee at 4 o'clock. She didn't drink it. Just held the warm cup in her hands and felt something that wasn't trembling. Something closer to the absence of trembling. The kind of calm that came from understanding you'd already survived worse than rumors. "He's working you," Rodriguez said, sitting next to her in the break room. "Setting the narrative before he makes a real move." "I know," Margaret said. "You going to let him?" She didn't answer. There was no answer yet. There was only the penknife in her pocket and the hollowed pen and the folded flag in her locker, the one that belonged to a man named Sergeant David Chen who died in her arms on a rooftop in Raleigh, who'd asked for water even though his lungs were filling with his own blood, who'd squeezed her hand once and then stopped squeezing. There was only the understanding that she'd already been erased once by the Pentagon, scrubbed from existence, buried so deep that her own service records didn't exist anymore. Compared to that, this was small. This was manageable. This was just a man with a nice watch trying to build a case against someone he'd already decided was expendable. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he had no idea who he was building a case against. The observation theater at Seattle General was packed. Tuesday morning, 0800 hours, and 43 residents and interns filled the amphitheater seating, pens poised over notepads, the kind of attention that only grand rounds commanded. Dr. Mercer stood at the podium like a general addressing troops, his tailored suit pressed to absolute perfection, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He pulled up a case file on the screen behind him, in no names, no patient identifiers, just the clinical details. Just enough for everyone in the room to know exactly who he meant. "A nurse," he began, letting the word sit like a stone in water, "recently took it upon herself to adjust a medication dosage without physician approval." His eye swept the room, letting the accusation settle. Yes, the patient survived. Yes, the outcome was positive. But the methodology was fundamentally reckless. Dangerous, even. This is precisely why protocols exist. This is why we have a hierarchy of responsibility. He clicked to the next slide, a close-up of Margaret's handwriting on the patient chart. Confidence without credentials is simply arrogance in scrubs. We cannot have staff who believe battlefield instincts. He paused, letting that word hang in the air like poison gas, trump medical training. Nurses who overstep don't just violate policy. They undermine the entire system that keeps patients safe. Margaret sat in the back row of the observation theater, her spine pressed against the cold metal chair, her hands folded in her lap. She wore the same scrubs as always, pale blue, no embellishments, no name tag visible from this distance. Her breathing was steady. In. Out. In. Out. Like meditation. Like dissociation. Her jaw didn't clench. Her eyes didn't water. She simply absorbed the words as if they were weather, a storm passing overhead, uncomfortable but temporary. Residents kept glancing back at her. They whispered behind their hands. Everyone knew who he meant. Everyone knew that Margaret had adjusted a medication dosage 3 weeks ago, had saved a patient from a fatal drug interaction. The hospital grapevine, that invisible network of gossip and half-truths, had already decided what the story was. Dr. Mercer had just made it official. He continued for another 8 minutes, constructing an entire lecture around her single decision, building a case against initiative, against instinct, against anyone who dared to think beyond the narrow lane he'd drawn for them. His voice never rose. His presentation was impeccable. By the time he finished, the residents looked at Margaret like she was a cautionary tale, a mistake wrapped in skin, a warning about what happens when someone forgets their place. The theater entered in the slow shuffle that always followed grand rounds. Margaret waited until the last resident had filtered out, then she stood, walked down the concrete stairs, and pushed through the double doors into the corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Her badge clattered against her sternum as she moved, a small metallic sound that seemed to echo in the empty hallway. 3 days later. Tuesday was Margaret's day off, so she didn't work it. Wednesday passed. Thursday arrived grey and humid, the kind of summer day in Raleigh where the heat pressed down like a physical weight. She was back at Seattle General on Thursday morning, 0700, already in her scrubs before the sun finished climbing. The break room was empty except for Dr. Mercer, who stood by the coffee station holding court to two residents, a man with nervous eyes and a woman with her phone already out, recording him mentally, storing his opinions like currency. "You know what concerns me most," Mercer was saying, his voice pitched low enough to seem confidential, intimate even, "is the kind of thinking that leads someone to believe 3 years of experience makes them an expert. Florence Nightingale's delusional granddaughter, right here in our own hospital." He laughed, and the residents laughed with him, the sound like a choir finding harmony. Associate's degree and a hero complex, dangerous combination. You see it with certain personality types. They fixate on some trauma narrative, some story about themselves being the real doctor, and suddenly they're making unilateral decisions about patient care. Margaret stood in the doorway, her hand still on the door handle. The break room was maybe 15 feet wide. The distance between where she stood and where Mercer stood was enough to be witnessed, not enough to be ignored. He saw her. He didn't stop talking. "The truly dangerous professionals," he continued, his eyes meeting hers across the room, "are the ones who know just enough to be confident but not enough to understand what they don't know. They walk around this hospital convinced they're saving lives, when really they're just creating liability exposure." One tear traced Margaret's right cheek. Just one. It fell like a raindrop from a cloudless sky, unexpected and precise. She reached up with her index finger and wiped it away while holding his gaze, her hand steady, her eyes locked on his. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, almost conversational, the kind of voice that makes you lean in to hear it. "I've triaged men with better character bleeding out in the sand." The room went dead silent. The coffee maker stopped gurgling. The fluorescent lights seemed to hold their hum. Even the air in the break room seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. Mercer laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, like a dog's bark. Dramatic. "Just chart your patience, Walsh." But he'd lost something in that moment. Margaret watched it happen across his face, not uncertainty, not quite, but a small recalibration. He didn't know what she meant. That was obvious. But he'd felt the weight of the words anyway, the way you feel the pressure before a storm even when you can't see the clouds. Margaret moved to the refrigerator, opened it, pulled out her lunch container. She closed the refrigerator door with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud. The two residents stared at their shoes. She was leaving the break room when Mercer spoke again, louder this time, performing for the residents. "You know, overcompensating rarely ends well," he said. "Chart your patience, Walsh. That's the job description." She didn't respond. She moved through the hallway with the same steady pace she'd maintained since entering the break room, and neither speed nor posture changed. The absence of reaction was its own kind of answer. By Friday afternoon, the story had metastasized through Seattle General like a virus. Margaret had made Mercer cry. Margaret had been insubordinate. Margaret had emotional outbursts. By evening, the narrative had calcified into official law. Half the staff wouldn't look at her. The other half looked at her too long, trying to decide what they'd witnessed. Mercer found her at the vending machine on Friday evening, the one by the physical therapy wing where fewer people congregated. The hallway was nearly empty. He stood beside her, also pretending to need coffee, also pretending this was coincidence. "You know," he said, not looking at her, just speaking to the machine, "I wonder what you're trying to prove." "Some trauma response, maybe. Trying to prove something to Daddy? Someone hurt you, and now you think you're invincible." He laughed, that same short bark. "That's what makes you dangerous, Margaret. That's what makes you a liability." Margaret inserted her dollar bill. The machine hummed. She selected black coffee, and the cup dropped into the slot with a metallic clink. She collected it, turned, and looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Her eyes held nothing, not anger, not fear, not even acknowledgement. Just observation. The way you'd look at an equation you'd already solved. She walked away without speaking. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with the evening's patient list spread in front of her. One name on that list made her hand pause over her laptop keyboard. John Covey, 42, admitted through the ER at 1400, chief complaint documented as altered mental status and communication deficit. She scrolled through his chart, found his medication history, cross-referenced it against his allergies and his current prescriptions. Her chest tightened. The combination Dr. Mercer had prescribed, a benzodiazepine and a particular class of antihistamine, contradicted John Covey's documented sensitivity. Margaret had flagged this exact interaction 3 weeks ago for a different patient, had submitted a formal medication concern through the proper channels, had documented her reasoning in clinical language. Dr. Mercer had reviewed her concern, stamped it, and filed it away. She typed out an email marked urgent, medication interaction concern patient Covey, J, same contraindication flagged previously. Recommend review before 0600 dosing. She hit send at 2,347 hours and closed her laptop. The next morning, at 0300, an ambulance pulled into Seattle General's emergency bay with lights and sirens and the kind of urgency that meant someone's body was failing. John Covey arrived on that stretcher unable to speak, and the irony of his condition, a mute patient with medication complications, would haunt Margaret for longer than she'd admit. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Mercer reviewed her email, read her concern, and ordered the same medication cocktail anyway. The ambulance bay doors at Seattle General slid open at 0300 hours. The stretcher came through first, wheels squeaking against wet asphalt, paramedics calling vitals in that rapid-fire shorthand that meant bad. On the stretcher was a man, early 30s, his body rigid as a plank, eyes staring at nothing. Behind him came his sister, running to keep pace, her voice breaking as she gripped the rail and spoke directly to the nearest nurse. His name is John Covey. He hasn't spoken since Fallujah, 2007, IED strike, shrapnel near his temporal lobe, the VA said permanent. He doesn't talk. He won't talk. And she held up her wrist, showing a medical alert bracelet. This bracelet. It has classified information. His unit, his service record, everything. I'm not letting anyone access his file without. Margaret was already moving toward Trauma Bay 3, her feet knowing the path before her mind caught up. The stretcher followed. The sister's voice followed. The panic followed. She'd heard that timbre of desperation before, in Ramadi, in the voices of men whose brothers weren't waking up. Inside the bay, John Covey's body convulsed once, hard enough to rattle the side rails. His mouth opened and closed without sound. A low keening came from his throat, not words, not quite language, just the primal sound of someone drowning in air. Margaret's hands were already assessing, already reading the story his body was telling. Dilated pupils. Tremor in the fingertips. The color draining from his face like water through a sieve. She caught the medication history on the monitor, already typed into the chart by Dr. Mercer 15 minutes ago. Haloperidol for the agitation. Standard. But underneath it, in the notes, patient exhibiting signs of neurological distress. Recommend addition of cisapride for gastric motility given limited oral intake. Margaret's chest went cold. She'd seen this combination before. Had written about this combination 2 days ago in an email to Mercer, with the subject line in all caps, dangerous interaction, haloperidol plus cisapride in patients with temporal lobe damage. The email had been marked red. He'd read it. And he'd ordered it anyway. Get me a crash cart, Margaret said quietly. Not a request. Not a question. The resident, a kid named Torres, maybe 26, looked at Mercer, who was walking in right then, coffee in hand, his expression the casual superiority of a man who'd never had to doubt himself. We're managing this medically, Nurse Walsh. Monitor vitals. I'll order. John Covey's back arched. His eyes rolled backward until only the white showed. His mouth opened wide, wider, and the sound that came out wasn't human. It was the sound of someone's airway collapsing, and Margaret could see the timeline in her head like a scrolling inventory. 90 seconds before hypoxic brain damage began. 45 seconds before his heart would quit trying. 30 seconds, maybe less, before this man became someone his sister would have to visit in a facility for the rest of her life. She was already moving. Down on one knee beside the gurney. Feeling for the cricothyroid membrane, the small notch of cartilage in the throat that was her gateway. Her left hand stabilized his neck. Her right hand pulled the penknife from her scrub pocket, the one she'd carried for 18 years, its blade curved and sharp from decades of use. "Step back," Mercer barked. His voice had the quality of something heavy being dragged across gravel. "That is not protocol. Step back." "No time," Margaret said. The blade went in clean. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just the muscle memory of Ramadi rooftops and men whose breathing had stopped and the knowledge that some decisions had to be made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The incision was small, maybe half an inch, right through the cricothyroid membrane. Blood, not much, just enough to show she'd found the right spot. She pulled the hollowed pen from her pocket. Standard ballpoint, the ink cartridge removed 18 years ago, the plastic tube left behind. It slid into the opening smoothly, like a key finding its lock. And then, the hiss. Air. Starving lungs pulling air down the improvised airway as if it was the only thing that mattered in the entire world. Because it was. John Covey's chest rose. Once. Twice. The color started coming back to his face, that terrible gray-white melting away into something that resembled human skin again. The monitor began to beep, and the rhythm it was showing was sinus, steady, a heartbeat that had come back from the edge of nothing. The room went so quiet Margaret could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Could hear the sister's breath hitching in her throat. Could hear Mercer's coffee cup hit the floor and shatter. She stayed on her knees beside John Covey for one more breath. 2. Just long enough to make sure the tube was staying in place, that his oxygen saturation was climbing, 68, 71, 75, 82, climbing like a plane that had almost crashed but was finding altitude again. She set the penknife down on the tray. The pen tube on the tray beside it. Then she stood. Mercer was already moving toward her, his face the color of raw meat, his voice like something breaking. "Security. Get security in here. Now. You just violated you committed assault, you performed." Margaret removed her badge. Placed it on the metal tray beside the instrument she'd just used to save a man's life. The badge caught the fluorescent light and threw it back at the ceiling like a small, dull star. Rodriguez, the scrub tech, a man who'd been a combat medic with the 160th SAW before he'd lost his left arm above the elbow and discovered he was still useful in other ways, stared at Margaret's hands. Stared at the sutures she hadn't left behind because she didn't use sutures for this kind of work. Stared at her face. "I know those hands," he said quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper, the kind of voice people used in hospitals at 0300 when most of the world was sleeping. "I know those stitches, Captain. I know that technique. Where did you serve?" Margaret looked at him. Just for a moment, long enough for the mask to slip, long enough for him to see what was underneath the soft voice and the deference and the years of making herself small. Long enough for him to see a woman who'd held a dying lieutenant in her hands while rounds came in from 3 directions and still managed to get his bleeding stopped because that's what Captain Margaret Walsh did, she did the work that couldn't be left undone. Then 2 security officers came through the doors. She walked out past them without a word. Walked past Torres, who was staring at her with his mouth open. Walked past the sister, who was looking at John Covey's chest rising and falling in that beautiful, steady rhythm that only mattered because Margaret had made it possible. The rain was coming down hard when she pushed through the ER doors. Not the gentle kind of rain. The kind that hammered the parking lot like something with a grudge. She sat in her car for a long time, hands gripped on the steering wheel, listening to the sound of water against metal. Her phone buzzed. She didn't look at it. Didn't need to. Mercer would already be filing his incident report. Already be documenting the penknife as a non-sterile instrument. Already be building his case in neat, bureaucratic language while John Covey got to breathe, got to come back to his sister, got to have another day, another week, another year, because Margaret had made a choice in the space of 30 seconds. Some choices cost everything. She turned the key. The engine turned over. Outside, rain kept falling, and somewhere in Seattle General, a man who hadn't spoken in 17 years was alive because a nurse had remembered what it felt like to be useful in a way that mattered. The incident report landed on Dr. Mercer's desk at 3:36 p.m., still warm from the printer, and he read it twice before realizing he hadn't written it yet. The mute veteran's airway had collapsed at 2:14 p.m. Margaret had opened it with a penknife and a hollowed ballpoint pen at 2:16 p.m. The man was breathing at 2:18 p.m. By 2:45 p.m., Mercer had already begun constructing his case, not an investigation, a fortress. Use of non-sterile instruments. Practicing medicine without a license. Creating massive liability exposure. The words stacked like ammunition, each one more damaging than the last. He worked through the night in his office with the door locked and the lights dimmed, the kind of focused intensity he usually reserved for surgeries. But this was surgery too, he told himself. Just a different kind. 40 pages. That was the target. 40 pages that no hospital board could ignore, no matter how grateful they felt about a patient who'd survived. Gratitude didn't hold up in a courtroom. Numbers did. Documentation did. A clear pattern of dangerous behavior stretched across 3 years did. By 3 a.m., he had the foundation, Margaret's medication adjustment that saved the ICU patient, framed as unauthorized protocol deviation. The residents he'd mentored for months, the ones whose coffee orders he'd learned, whose career ambitions he'd listened to over lunch, they provided statements without hesitation when he called them. She seemed confident, maybe overconfident. I wasn't sure if what she did was within her scope. She acted like a doctor, not a nurse. None of them used those words naturally. He'd shaped them like clay. He'd spent 3 months teaching them how to doubt her, and now they were simply confirming what he'd already whispered into existence. By dawn, the pages numbered 38. He added 2 more, a timeline of pattern escalation and a risk assessment that quantified her existence at Seattle General as a significant patient safety threat. At 6:38 a.m., he hand-delivered it to the hospital board chair with a recommendation stamped in red ink, immediate termination pending investigation. The board chair didn't meet his eyes when he left. That was good. Mercer understood power, understood that sometimes the person who didn't need to watch your reaction was the person who'd already decided. Margaret received the suspension letter at 9:04 a.m. by courier service, hand-signed by the hospital administrator. The envelope was thick, official, the kind of white that seemed to glow in the morning light streaming through her kitchen window. Pending investigation of gross negligence, suspended without pay effective immediately. Hospital property access revoked. Final review board convenes Friday 10 a.m. Her hands didn't shake when she opened it. They didn't shake when she read it. They didn't shake when she set it on the counter and walked upstairs to shower before Emma's school pickup, because trembling was a luxury she'd never been allowed. But in the parking lot of Raleigh Elementary at 3:15 p.m., sitting in the driver's seat with the engine off and rain beginning to tap the windshield like Morse code, she understood what 8 years of erasure meant. She'd been Captain Margaret Walsh, commander of a 7-person extraction team, authorized to make life-and-death decisions in real time. Then she'd been nobody. Then she'd been a nurse. Then she'd been a ghost pretending to be a nurse. And now she was sitting in a car at 3:15 in the afternoon when she should have been giving report to the night shift, and there was no going back from this. Emma was the 3rd child out the double doors, backpack swinging, teacher's hand release, sprint toward the minivan with a kind of joy that only 8-year-olds could access. She clambered in, buckled herself, I did it without help, Mommy, like you said, and began narrating her day in real-time art class, spelling test where she got almost perfect, the boy who pushed her on the slide but said sorry, so that was okay. Margaret drove on autopilot, making the right turns, arriving at the right house, parking in the right spot. She made grilled cheese for dinner at 5:33 p.m. Helped with homework at 6:15 p.m. Bath time at 7:22 p.m. Bedtime story at 7:45 p.m. At 8:51 p.m., after Emma's breathing had shifted into the deep rhythm of real sleep, Margaret went to the kitchen table and sat in the dark. She didn't turn on the lights. The rain hammered the windows like gunfire, steady and without mercy, and she sat very still and thought about Master Sergeant Daniels, who died covering her extraction in Raleigh 17 years ago, whose blood she could still feel on her hand some nights when the sleep wouldn't come. She'd kept the flag from his locker for 8 years. Kept it folded, kept it hidden, kept it because it was the only proof he'd existed, the only proof any of them had existed. She retrieved it now from the back of her bedroom closet, behind winter coats that never got worn in Raleigh. The flag was smaller than she remembered. The flag was always smaller. Margaret knew this intellectually, but her hands didn't seem to understand. She brought it to the kitchen and sat at the table and unfolded it very slowly, the plastic crackling in the silence. The flag smelled like cardboard and time and the particular emptiness of things that had been preserved too carefully. Her fingers traced the folds. 17 lives. She could name every one of them. Daniels. Holbrook. Chen. Rodriguez, not the IT specialist, a different Rodriguez, a Marine Lance Corporal with 2 kids he'd never met. Garrett. Okafor. The list continued in her head with the precision of names carved into concrete. 17 lives. And 1 mute veteran who wasn't on any list because his extraction had been classified even deeper, buried in a hole so dark that the Pentagon would deny he'd ever been there at all. The kitchen light flickered. Storm surge, probably. The power stuttered, recovered. Margaret sat at the table with the folded flag and did not move until she heard Emma's voice from upstairs, very small and uncertain, "Mommy." Margaret closed her eyes for 1 breath. 2. Then she folded the flag with precision, thirds and thirds and thirds, the way you did in the presence of death, and set it on the table beside her. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, hair mussed with sleep, eyes uncertain. She was supposed to be sleeping. She wasn't crying. She was just looking at her mother with the kind of clarity that only children possessed, the kind that saw through every lie. "Mommy, why are you home when it's still light outside?" Margaret didn't have an answer that a child could understand. She didn't have an answer that she could understand. The suspension letter sat on the counter under the kitchen light, the word still readable even in shadow, pending investigation, gross negligence, effective immediately. She reached out and Emma came to her, small and warm and real in a way that nothing else was anymore. "Come here, baby," Margaret said, and Emma climbed into her lap the way she had when she was smaller, when the world made sense because it was small enough to fit inside her mother's arms. The rain kept falling. Outside, somewhere in the dark streets of Raleigh, there was a hospital where Margaret Walsh didn't exist anymore. Where Dr. Mercer was probably still awake, refreshing his email, waiting to see if anyone had responded to the 40-page documentation of her destruction. Where a mute man named John Covey was breathing through an airway Margaret had created with nothing but knowledge and necessity and hands that remembered how to do impossible things. But inside this kitchen, in the dark, there was only a mother and her daughter. There was the folded flag that Margaret had been ordered to forget. There was the knowledge that everything she'd hidden had just been exposed, that the erasure had failed, that Captain Margaret Walsh was standing at the edge of a precipice with no way down except through. And there was one more thing that Margaret didn't understand yet, one thing that was already in motion, something that would arrive Friday morning in dress uniform and demand answers from people who'd never learned how to speak to gods. 3 days later, the hospital board convened in the mahogany-paneled conference room on the 14th floor. 8 administrators sat around a glass table that reflected the gray Seattle sky outside. Dr. Mercer had arrived early, spreading his documentation like a fortress, 40 pages of incident reports, fabricated patient complaints, statements from staff he'd spent months poisoning against Margaret Walsh. He was smiling. The kind of smile that comes from a man who believes the machinery of bureaucracy will grind in his favor, that paper trails and institutional authority trump everything else. The folder was thick enough to convince anyone. Except the people walking through the door next. John Covey was wheeled in first. The mute veteran had spent 72 hours in the ICU, extubated, breathing on his own, the emergency airway Margaret had carved into his throat already beginning to scar over. His sister pushed the wheelchair while John's trembling hand gripped the armrest. He hadn't spoken since the medication interaction seized his nervous system. Hadn't needed to. His eyes found Margaret standing at the back of the conference room, the only person not seated, and his lips moved, not with sound, but with intention. One word shaped by a throat that Margaret had saved. Angel. The room didn't understand it yet. Not until his sister unfolded a printed document and began to read, her voice breaking on every syllable like the paper itself was too heavy to carry. Captain Margaret Walsh, United States Army Special Forces Command, 5th Battalion, Fort Liberty. Citation for conspicuous gallantry in action, Ramadi, Anbar Province, Iraq, October 2004. While attached to Joint Task Force Raider, then Captain Walsh identified a deteriorating medical casualty with signs of tension pneumothorax during sustained combat operations. Using only a field knife and improvised materials, she performed an emergency thoracotomy under fire, maintaining pressure on the wounded service member's heart while rounds impacted the concrete 30 centimeters from her position. 17 lives saved during that 72-hour siege. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Commendation for valor that remains classified. His sister's hand shook as she set the citation down. My brother knows an angel when he meets one. The door at the back of the conference room opened without warning. General Marcus Haven, 2 stars catching the fluorescent light like steel, walked in unannounced and stood at attention. His uniform was dress blues, immaculate, the kind of precision that makes ordinary uniforms look like costumes. He carried a frame. Inside the frame hung the Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts on ribbon bars, the medals catching light like they'd never been stored in darkness. Like they'd been waiting for this exact moment to shine. The general saluted, not a casual gesture, but the full formal salute of a commander acknowledging his subordinate officer. His hand moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, the kind of control that comes from 30 years of command. The sound of that salute landed in the room like the crack of a rifle. Boots on tile. One sharp motion. Fist to chest. Done. Dr. Mercer stood up. His face had gone the color of institutional walls. I don't understand. She's not cleared to. Captain Walsh was operating under Presidential Classification Level 7, General Haven said. His voice was quiet. Not raised. That was worse. Quiet voices in military dress uniforms don't need volume. Her credentials are so far above your clearance you'll never see them. Not in this lifetime. Not ever. He turned to look at Mercer the way a soldier looks at a roadside IED he's just noticed too late. Not angry. Just aware of the damage that was already done. You promoted an active duty special operations officer while she was undercover in civilian infrastructure. Then you filed paperwork to terminate her based on fabricated patient complaints and documented witness tampering. Do you understand what you've done? Mercer opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The fortress of paper suddenly looked like what it was, the desperate scrawling of a man who'd tried to destroy a legend and written his own confession in the process. That's when Rodriguez walked in. The IT specialist, a Navy veteran with the bearing of someone who'd spent time on destroyers, carried a laptop and a stack of surveillance disks. He'd spent 3 weeks in the server room pulling metadata, reconstruction logs, deleted file recovery protocols that only someone who'd worked military-grade encryption could access. He placed the laptop on the conference table and turned it to face the board. Dr. Mercer entered the server room at 2:51 a.m. on 4 separate occasions, Rodriguez said, his voice steady as a sonar ping. October 12th, 14th, 16th, and 19th. each time attempting to access and delete footage from the trauma bay where Captain Walsh performed the emergency cricothyrotomy on Mr. Covey. Here's the footage he didn't find. The video played. Margaret's hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this before, the penknife steady, the hollowed pen becoming an airway, her voice low and certain, "You're going to breathe. I've got you." The board watched. Some of them had voted to fire her. Now they were watching her save a life. Rodriguez pulled up the emails next. 5 years of them. Messages to residents warning them that Walsh is dangerous. Notes to HR fabricating patient complaints that never happened. A draft termination letter dated 6 months before the cricothyrotomy. Mercer had been planning her destruction regardless. Not because of something she'd done. Just because she was there, and competent, and he was afraid of competence he didn't understand. The emails smelled like desperation when you read between the lines, like the electronic equivalent of a man writing suicide notes and signing them with accusations. "There's more," Rodriguez said. 3 former nurses came forward during the board's preliminary investigation. Similar pattern. Each one driven out of medicine entirely by targeted harassment, false documentation, and systematic character assassination. This isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern of predatory behavior targeting competent women in clinical settings. He closed the laptop. Captain Walsh's service record alone is worth more than this entire hospital's operational budget. The fact that she was willing to work here as a nurse tells you everything you need to know about her character. The fact that you tried to destroy her tells you everything you need to know about his. Margaret hadn't moved. She was standing at the back of the conference room in civilian scrubs, but her posture had shifted into something different. Not aggressive. Just authoritative. The way a captain stands when the situation is her responsibility now. General Haven stepped aside and gestured toward the table. "Captain Walsh. If you want to say anything, this board will listen." Every face in the room turned. 8 administrators, all of them watching the woman they'd voted to fire 3 days ago. John Covey's wheelchair was positioned so he could see her clearly. His trembling had stopped. Rodriguez stood silent. General Haven stood at attention, still. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to pause in their hum. Margaret walked to the table. Her boots on the polished floor made the softest sound, like rain on concrete, present but not demanding attention. She looked at each board member individually. The kind of look that tells you she's memorized every face, every vote, every contribution to your own destruction. "You have 2 choices," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not threatening. Just clear as a tactical readout. "You terminate Dr. Mercer for cause today, effective immediately, with full documentation of evidence tampering and patient endangerment going to the State Medical Board. You offer Mr. Covey a settlement that reflects what you did to him. And you apologize." She paused. "Let them sit with it. Or I make one phone call to the FBI, and this entire hospital gets investigated for gross negligence resulting in preventable patient harm. Your insurance carriers will drop you. Your federal funding gets frozen. Your reputation gets burned to the foundation. Your choice. You have 10 minutes. The board didn't need 10 minutes. By noon, Dr. Mercer had been escorted from the building for the last time. By evening, the State Medical Board had opened a formal investigation. By the following Monday, 3 additional nurses had filed formal complaints about his conduct over the previous 5 years. The pattern was devastating. The documentation was overwhelming. The emails read like a confession he didn't even realize he was writing. John Covey watched from his hospital bed as the news cycle shifted. Margaret had been right. The truth didn't just silence the room. It brought the hospital to its knees. She stood beside his wheelchair the day he was discharged, his sister on his other side, and John's hand found hers. He couldn't speak. Never would again. The vocal cords were too damaged from the seizure and the emergency airway. But his eyes said everything. "Thank you. Welcome home. I know who you are. Margaret squeezed his hand once. You have a good life ahead of you, John. Live it for the both of us. If you're watching this and someone in your world is being systematically destroyed by someone with institutional power, don't wait for the truth to surface on its own. Document everything. Record the harassment. Keep the emails. Save the evidence. And find someone with the courage to speak when it matters. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, have you ever watched someone's reputation get destroyed by lies? What would you have done in Margaret's position?